In the early hours of September 1st, 1939, the battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on Polish positions in Danzig, while armored columns crossed the border and Luftwaffe squadrons dived on strategic targets. In minutes, defensive lines were overcome, communications interrupted, and cities exposed to a system of attack based on speed and coordination. What began as a specific offensive turned into a chain of operations executed with control and precision that, in a few years, mobilized more than 100 million soldiers and left more than 60 million dead. Cities such as Warsaw, Stalingrad, and Dresden were reduced to rubble, while millions of people were displaced or captured. But even within that system, failures began to appear. Missions that did not return, incomplete operations, and records interrupted without explanation. In a war where everything had to be documented, those gaps could never be reconstructed. What happened in those cases that even today remain a mystery? Dirigible L-8, the flight that returned with no one on board. At 6:03 in the morning on August 16, 1942, a United States Navy blimp took off from Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay as part of a routine anti-submarine patrol. The aircraft, identified as L-8, belonged to Airship Patrol Squadron 32 within the coastal surveillance system implemented after the entry of the United States into the war. On board were two men, Lieutenant Ernest DeWitt Cody, age 27, and Ensign Charles E. Adams, age 35, both with experience in lighter-than-air aircraft. The apparatus, armed with 2 depth charges and a .30 caliber machine gun, had accumulated more than 1,000 flights without recent incidents and had been inspected shortly before takeoff. Conditions were stable and visibility sufficient. Its route would take it toward the Farallon Islands, then to Point Reyes, and finally back to the Golden Gate Bridge, within a context of reinforced surveillance due to the presence of Japanese submarines off the coast. At 7:38 a.m., the L-8 sent a message reporting the detection of an oil slick about 6.4 kilometers off the coast. This type of signal could indicate the presence of a submerged submarine. 4 minutes later, they communicated that they would investigate the area. From nearby vessels, witnesses observed how the blimp descended to about 9 meters above the water and launched smoke flares to mark the zone. That was the last confirmed contact with the crew. Shortly after 9:00 a.m., the aircraft dropped ballast, gained altitude, and drifted toward the east, in the direction of San Francisco. During the following hours, it was seen by several pilots and observers without evident signs of emergency. However, as time passed, its behavior became irregular. It descended to a low altitude. Its envelope seemed to deform, and it showed signs of loss of pressure. At 11:15 a.m., the L-8 appeared off Ocean Beach, moving slowly toward land. Fishermen tried to hold it when it descended briefly, but upon looking into the gondola, they confirmed that there was no one on board. The blimp rose again, struck a hill, lost one of its depth charges, and began to release helium, deforming its structure. It continued its trajectory over urban areas, brushing against poles and houses until crashing on Bellevue Avenue in Daly City. The impact damaged the engines, bent the propellers, and spilled fuel. Severed electric cables generated sparks while a crowd gathered at the site. Firefighters and police arrived quickly, prepared to rescue the occupants. But upon inspecting the cabin, they found an intact and disturbing scene. There was no trace of the pilots. Inside the gondola, the parachutes remained in their place. The life raft was intact, and the radio worked. The door was open and secured toward the outside, something unusual in flight. A briefcase with classified documents was still present. The life jackets were not there, although this was not conclusive, as crew members usually wore them during missions over the sea. Testimonies added contradictions. Some claimed not to have seen anyone on board before the landing, while others claimed to have distinguished figures in the cabin hours after the last transmission. There was even mention of the presence of 3 people in the gondola. The Navy deployed search operations by air, sea, and land without results. The investigation concluded that there was no attack nor critical failures. Cody and Adams were never found, and in 1943 they were declared dead. The official explanation proposed that one of the crew members fell into the water and the second tried to rescue him. However, this hypothesis does not explain the absence of an emergency signal, nor the subsequent sightings. The blimp returned alone and ended up falling in Daly City. what occurred between the last transmission and that moment could never be established. Foo Fighters, lights that followed the pilots in the middle of the war. During the final phase of the Second World War, the operational records of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron began to include observations that did not fit within the usual parameters. In the midst of data on routes, altitudes, and possible hostile contacts, a recurring element emerged: the presence of lights that could not be associated with any identified aircraft nor known activity. These observations began to repeat in different missions over the Rhine Valley, in territory under German control, maintaining similar patterns without relation to confirmed enemy aerial activity. In November 1944, a Bristol Beaufighter was conducting a nocturnal patrol north of Strasbourg. The crew was composed of the pilot Edward Schluter, the radar operator Donald J. Myers, and the intelligence officer Fred Ringwald. The mission proceeded without incidents until, in full flight, they detected a series of luminous points of intense orange hue. They were between 8 and 10 lights that remained aligned next to the left wing of the apparatus. Their movement was uniform and sustained, without sudden variations in speed. The radar system did not register any contact, and from the ground there was no confirmation of air traffic in that sector. Despite the visual proximity, there was no technical correspondence to explain their presence. Schluter executed a direct maneuver with the intention of intercepting them. At the moment in which he reduced the distance, the lights disappeared without visible transition. Minutes later, they reappeared at a greater distance, maintaining the same behavior. They remained in that state during a brief interval before vanishing completely. It was Donald J. Myers who assigned a designation to these objects, taking an expression of popular use: Foo Fighters. The term was recorded in the squadron reports and began to be used in subsequent missions where similar phenomena were reported. As the weeks passed, the sightings increased. The lights appeared alone or in formation, changed color, and performed maneuvers that the fighters could not follow. There were no attacks nor attempts at contact, but their constant presence kept the crews on alert. One of the pilots summarized it in his report: he was scared to death. Flight 19, the squadron that became disoriented and never returned. At 14:10 on December 5, 1945, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers took off from the Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station in Florida to execute a training exercise named Navigation Problem Number 1. The mission combined bombing and navigation practices on a previously established route that included 3 main legs and a return to the base. On board traveled 14 aviators, among pilots and instructors from the United States Navy and Marine Corps. The leader of the flight was Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, age 28, with more than 2,500 accumulated flight hours, including 606 in Avenger aircraft. Although he had combat experience in the Pacific, it was the first time he directed this specific exercise in the area of the Bahamas. The other pilots, with an average of 300 flight hours, were on their 3rd navigation practice. All aircraft had been previously checked, full fuel for approximately 5.5 hours, survival equipment operational and meteorological conditions qualified as favorable, with moderate to rough sea. The plan consisted of flying heading 091 degrees for 56 nautical miles to the Hens and Chicken Shoals, performing bombing practices for about 30 minutes, continuing 67 miles on the same heading, turning to 346 degrees for 73 miles passing through Grand Bahama, and finally turning to 241 degrees to return to Fort Lauderdale. The exercise was to be completed in approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes. The initial operation developed as planned. Toward 15:00, one of the pilots requested authorization to drop his last bomb, a signal that the first phase had concluded correctly. However, at 15:40, an alteration in communications began to be detected. A transmission intercepted by Lieutenant Robert F. Cox, who was in independent flight, revealed that one of the pilots could not determine his position. "I don't know where we are. We must have got lost after that last turn." Shortly after, Cox managed to establish contact with the leader of the flight. Taylor's response was immediate and precise. Both compasses were broken and he could not locate Fort Lauderdale. He claimed to be overland, convinced that he was flying over the Florida Keys, although he could not determine his exact position nor the correct direction to return. This interpretation was inconsistent with the time elapsed since takeoff, which indicated that the squadron was probably over the Bahamas. Communications began to fragment. From the ground, repeated instructions were issued for the group to fly toward the west, heading 270 degrees, which should have led them directly to the Florida coast. However, Taylor doubted his location and continually modified the heading. At 16:45, he communicated that they would fly at 030 degrees for 45 minutes to avoid the Gulf of Mexico. Minutes later, he ordered a change to 090 degrees, generating confusion among the other pilots. During this period, some members of the squadron expressed disagreement over the radio, pointing out that flying toward the west would allow them to return to the mainland. However, formation discipline was maintained and no plane left the grouping. As the afternoon progressed, the weather began to deteriorate, with winds of approximately 22 knots and increasingly rough sea. At 1750, ground stations managed to triangulate the position of the flight, situating it less than 100 nautical miles east of Florida, north of the Bahamas. However, this information was not transmitted directly to the squadron. By that moment, radio contact was already intermittent, and the orientation capacity of the group was compromised. At 1804, Taylor ordered a new heading change toward the east, moving away from the coast. Visibility was already low. The last clear transmission, around 1904, was from a pilot trying to contact without response. Minutes before, Taylor had ordered to maintain formation and prepare to ditch. The squadron was possibly more than 200 miles out to sea. Faced with the loss of contact, the search was activated. At 1927, a Martin PBM-5 Mariner seaplane took off with 13 crew members. Minutes later, it also disappeared. At 21:15, a ship reported an explosion on that same route. During 5 days, more than 200 aircraft tracked the area without finding remains. The Mariner was attributed to an explosion in flight. Of Flight 19, no trace was found. Submarine U-530, the unexpected return after the end of the war. On July 10, 1945, an unidentified silhouette appeared off the coast of Mar del Plata. In the early hours of the morning, fishermen operating a few kilometers from the coast observed the emergence of a submarine. The vessel, which did not match the models in service in the Argentine Navy, made light signals toward the naval base. Minutes later, from land, the communication was answered. The message transmitted was direct. It was a German submarine requesting to surrender. The commander of the Mar del Plata Naval Base, Lieutenant Commander Ramon Sayus, authorized the controlled entry. Identified as U-530, the vessel advanced slowly until being moored in proximity to the Coast Guard ship General Belgrano. On deck, Lieutenant Otto Vermuth, age 25, lined up his 54 crew members, mostly between 19 and 24 years old. The general state evidenced prolonged wear, the hull presented visible corrosion, and the interior showed signs of operational neglect. The first inspections revealed that the submarine had been stripped of a large part of its equipment. Before arriving, the crew had thrown into the sea the deck gun, anti-aircraft armament, torpedoes, ammunition, electronic systems, and devices considered sensitive. Also missing were the navigation charts, the code books, and the logbook, which prevented accurately reconstructing the route taken in the previous weeks. The U-530 had set sail from Kiel on February 19, 1945. After resupplying in Kristiansand, it headed toward the North Atlantic. According to subsequent statements, the surrender of Germany surprised them in full navigation. Despite the surrender orders issued, the crew decided not to go to the assigned ports. The choice of destination generated internal debate, finally leaning toward Argentina, considered a more favorable alternative. During its final voyage, the submarine operated without contact with Allied stations. It sailed submerged during the day and emerged at night to recharge batteries. As time passed, conditions on board deteriorated. Maintenance was reduced, discipline began to suffer, and operational tasks were affected. Upon approaching South America with limited resources, the decision was made to eliminate any element that could compromise the crew during an eventual inspection. The arrival of the U-530 generated an immediate reaction. The presence of a German submarine weeks after the end of the war activated suspicions, including the possibility that it had transported members of the Nazi regime or been linked to the sinking of the Brazilian cruiser Bahia. Argentine authorities initiated interrogations and expert assessments. The crew denied both hypotheses, and navigation calculations ruled out its participation in that incident. On July 13, the Argentine Navy reported that no evidence existed linking it with these facts. However, the lack of documentation and the destruction of equipment prevented reconstructing its final journey. Days later, the submarine and its crew were handed over to the Allied authorities. Amber Room, the dismantled treasure that never reappeared. In September 1941, during the German advance on the Soviet Union, Nazi army units occupied the Tsarskoye Selo complex on the outskirts of Leningrad. Inside the palace, they located a complete room lined with amber panels, accompanied by mirrors, reliefs, and mosaics. The Amber Room, moved there decades before, was considered one of the most valuable pieces of the Russian imperial heritage. The dismantling began shortly after the occupation. Specialized teams removed the panels with precision, avoiding damage to a material that had become fragile over time. Each section was packed under technical supervision and prepared for its transfer. In a few weeks, the set was evacuated toward German territory. The destination was Königsberg Castle in East Prussia. Under the authority of Erich Koch, responsible for the Nazi Party in the region, the room was reassembled and partially exhibited from November 1941 as a recovered object. During the following years, it remained in that place as part of the complex. At the end of 1943, the Soviet bombings over Königsberg intensified. Faced with the increasing risk, it was ordered to dismantle the room again. The pieces were packed and moved to protected areas within the castle to avoid structural damage. In January 1945, with the advance of the Red Army over East Prussia, new instructions were issued. Erich Koch arranged for the panels to be placed in 24 reinforced boxes, prepared for their evacuation. The packing was completed on January 15th. The boxes were moved to the castle courtyard and grouped awaiting their transfer. That was the last documented moment. No confirmation exists that the boxes left Königsberg, nor verifiable evidence regarding their subsequent destination. Some statements indicated that they could have been seen at a railway station, but there are no records that support that movement. From that point, the trail is interrupted. After the fall of the city, searches were conducted in the area without results. During the following years, expeditions examined mines, tunnels, and underground structures in Germany and Eastern Europe without locating the set. In 1997, a concrete clue appeared, a mosaic identified as an original part, in the hands of the family of a soldier who participated in the packing of 1945. The find confirmed the dispersion of the pieces, but not their final destination. Hypotheses point to its destruction during the bombings, or to its transfer to underground deposits. However, none has been able to be verified. The 24 boxes prepared in Königsberg were never located again. Los Angeles, 1942. A night of fire against invisible targets. In the early morning of February 25, 1942, on the southern coast of California, air raid sirens began to sound simultaneously at multiple points. At 2:21 hours, a general blackout was decreed over the city of Los Angeles and its surroundings. The power supply was interrupted, radio stations suspended their transmissions, and more than 1 million people were left in total darkness. 12,000 anti-aircraft lookouts occupied their observation posts, while defense batteries were prepared for a possible incursion. Tension had been building since the day before. On February 24, naval intelligence had issued a warning pointing to the possibility of an attack within a period of 10 hours. That same afternoon, flashing lights were recorded off the coast, which activated a first alarm between 1918 and 22:23 hours. Although the situation stabilized temporarily, surveillance systems remained on alert. During the night, radars detected an echo about 120 miles west of Los Angeles. The contact was followed briefly before disappearing from the screens. Despite this, notices from the ground continued. The presence of unidentified apparatuses at different points along the coast was reported. At 2:43 hours, activity over Long Beach was communicated, and minutes later, an artillery officer pointed out the existence of approximately 25 targets at about 12,000 feet in height over the city. At 3:16 hours, batteries located in Santa Monica opened fire against a visible presence in the sky that emitted a reddish light. From that moment, the entire defensive system entered into action. Searchlights illuminated the airspace, and anti-aircraft units began to fire continuously. For more than 1 hour, the sky over Los Angeles was crossed by bursts directed at targets that varied in number, size, and behavior. Records described elements that moved at different speeds and altitudes. Some were observed at low altitude, while others were situated above 20,000 feet. Individual units to numerous concentrations were mentioned. In certain cases, they seemed to move slowly or remain suspended, while in others, they reached speeds close to 200 miles per hour. Lights with irregular trajectories and abrupt changes of direction were also documented. During the engagement, approximately 1,430 anti-aircraft projectiles were fired without shooting down any target or locating remains, nor were any impacts recorded over the city. The fire ceased at 4:14 and the alarm was lifted at 7:12. Damage was limited and the casualties, between 1 and 6 people, were due to indirect causes. Testimonies were contradictory. Some observed nothing, while others described multiple objects or a presence that did not react to the fire. That same day, authorities offered different versions. Frank Knox qualified it as a false alarm, while the War Department recognized the presence of unidentified objects. A report to President Roosevelt confirmed that they were detected and attacked without results. Rommel's gold. The shipment sunk before being able to escape. During the final phase of the North African campaign in 1943, German units linked to the command of Erwin Rommel were associated with the seizure of high-value goods in Tunisian territory. Among these, gold reserves and objects obtained from the Jewish population on the island of Jerba are mentioned. The total volume was estimated at more than £20 million, constituting one of the most significant shipments related to looting operations on that front. In the midst of the German retreat following Allied pressure, the evacuation of these goods out of the region was organized. The shipment was prepared for its sending toward Europe, establishing as an intermediate point the island of Corsica, from where its final transfer toward German territory was projected. The movement toward Corsica was carried out in an unstable scenario. Land routes through Italy presented high risks from Allied air attacks and actions by partisan forces, which forced the discarding of that route and the choice of a maritime alternative that would reduce exposure. In this context appears the testimony of Peter Fleig, a 21-year-old engineer and diver assigned to technical tasks. He received orders to move to Corsica with full diving equipment, under instructions to keep the operation secret and eliminate any evidence after its execution. His arrival in Bastia occurred during the night. On the island, he was led to military facilities, where he was introduced to the officers responsible for the operation: Gunther Kranz, Hans Schaub, and Albert Hofmeier. They had the task of managing the shipment of the cargo toward Germany, although the operational situation had already changed. The initial plan contemplated the transfer by land through Italy, but the impossibility of guaranteeing that route forced a modification of the strategy. A maritime departure via a convoy was chosen. However, upon arriving at the planned point, the naval formation had already departed, leaving the group without immediate capacity for evacuation. Given the lack of vessels and the risk of capture, the shipment was moved to the coast of Bastia and submerged in the sea with the intention of recovering it after the conflict. The coordinates were never recorded. A note on a photograph suggests a point near the coast, but underwater explorations have not managed to locate anything. The destination of the 6 boxes remains unconfirmed. They were never recovered. Swamp Ghost, the bomber that remained intact for decades. On February 23, 1942, a B-17E Flying Fortress bomber disappeared in one of the most inaccessible areas of the Pacific after a combat mission. The aircraft, identified as 412446, belonged to the 19th Bomb Group and had been sent from Australia toward Rabaul on the island of New Britain in one of the first long-range operations after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The mission developed with multiple failures from the start. Of the 9 apparatuses assigned, several failed to take off or returned due to mechanical problems. Those that continued became scattered due to visibility conditions. In that scenario, the plane piloted by Captain Fred Eaton reached the target without close support. During the approach, the bomb bay did not respond on the first attempt, forcing a second pass under enemy fire. In that interval, the apparatus was hit by Japanese anti-aircraft artillery, which damaged the wing without detonating the load. The crew managed to complete the attack, but the impact compromised the fuel system. On the return journey, the level dropped progressively until leaving the plane without autonomy to reach Port Moresby. Without safe references and with the aircraft losing stability, the pilot identified from the air a surface that seemed firm. However, it was an expanse covered with vegetation that hid the Agimbo Swamp in Papua New Guinea. The landing was performed with the gear retracted. The fuselage descended onto the apparent surface and partially sank into the saturated terrain. The aircraft remained immobilized in an area where the density of the vegetation and the water prevented any subsequent maneuver. From that moment, its location was left out of any operational record. The crew survived the impact with minor injuries. Without the possibility of remaining at the site, they began a retreat on foot through swampy terrain, advancing through thick vegetation and without defined routes. For days, they crossed flooded areas, enduring high temperatures, lack of food, and constant exposure to insects. All contracted malaria during the journey. After reaching an inhabited area, they were assisted by local villagers who facilitated their movement by river via canoes. Subsequently, they were handed over to Australian authorities and evacuated toward Port Moresby. They arrived on April 1, 1942, 36 days after the accident. After a brief recovery period, they returned to active service. The bomber was not recovered nor located. Its exact position was not recorded, and the environment in which it had remained immobilized prevented any recognition from the ground. As the war progressed, the apparatus completely disappeared from operational records, without effective search attempts in the area. For almost 30 years, the plane remained hidden in the swamp without being detected. The combination of geographical isolation, plant cover, and terrain conditions prevented its location. There were no confirmed reports, no visible remains, nor precise references regarding its position. In 1972, a team from the Royal Australian Air Force spotted it by accident. From the air, the silhouette of the plane appeared complete, partially submerged but clearly recognizable. The find allowed it to be identified as the Swamp Ghost. Despite having remained for decades in a humid and isolated environment, the aircraft preserved a large part of its original structure. For years it remained in the place until, in 2010, it was finally recovered and moved to the United States, almost 7 decades after its last flight. What is difficult to explain is not its disappearance, but its state, how it managed to maintain itself in those conditions for so long in the middle of a swamp. The Walberzic train, the hidden convoy that no one has found. In the last months of the Second World War, while the Red Army advanced toward the west, German units initiated the evacuation of high-value materials from occupied territories. In that context, testimonies emerged pointing to the movement of an armored train loaded with looted goods, among them precious metals, works of art, and documentation considered sensitive. The transport would have been directed toward the region of Lower Silesia, in Poland, in the vicinity of Wałbrzych. In that area, Project Reese was being developed, an underground complex excavated in the Owl Mountains. The facilities, built with forced labor, included extensive galleries, internal chambers, and accesses prepared to resist bombings and hide operations. According to various accounts, the train was introduced into one of these underground accesses in the days prior to the arrival of Soviet forces in 1945. From that moment, no confirmation of its departure exists. The partial destruction of the infrastructures and the absence of verifiable records prevented reconstructing its route. One of the most persistent testimonies corresponds to Tadeusz Słowikowski, who claimed to have known of the existence of the train since 1950. According to his version, the initial information came from an individual who mentioned a sealed tunnel in the area. From that point, he developed a prolonged search based on maps, photographs, and indirect references linked to the underground structures. Among the elements he considered key was an image dated May 5, 1945, where a construction appeared that, according to his interpretation, controlled access to one of the entry points. The area would have been modified before the arrival of Soviet forces, which hindered subsequent verification. During the following decades, different teams performed explorations without conclusive results. Searches concentrated on specific sectors associated with Project Reese, but the complexity of the terrain and the lack of documentation limited their scope. In 2015, the case acquired new visibility when Piotr Kopa and Andreas Richter claimed to have identified an underground structure via ground-penetrating radar. The images showed an elongated shape of approximately 100 meters in the vicinity of kilometer 65 of the railway line between Wrocław and Wałbrzych. The find gave rise to an operation supervised by Polish authorities. Excavations were carried out, but the existence of the train was not confirmed. The anomalies corresponded to natural formations. Explorations continued in nearby areas where undelimited cavities were detected. However, no intervention managed to identify the convoy. The underground system of Project Reese remains without a complete explanation. In that context, the Wałbrzych train has never been located. Peking Man, the fossils that were lost during the evacuation. Between the decades of 1920 and 1930, excavations in the Zhoukoudian cave south of Peking allowed the recovery of more than 200 fossil remains belonging to individuals of Homo erectus. These finds, associated with at least 6 individuals, including 2 adolescents, were key for the study of human evolution. Their age, estimated between 300,000 and 500,000 years, placed them among the most relevant sets for understanding the expansion of the first hominids in Asia. During the Second World War, faced with the advance of Japanese forces in China, authorities decided to protect the fossils through their evacuation. The remains were packed in boxes with the intention of transferring them under United States military custody. The plan contemplated their shipment toward the United States, using a Marine Corps base as an intermediate point before maritime transport. In 1941, the boxes were moved to the port of Qinhuangdao, known then as Qinhuangdao. That place marked the last documented point of the transfer. From there, the trail is interrupted. In the midst of active military operations, the cargo disappeared without leaving a verifiable record regarding its destination. It was not established if the boxes managed to embark, if they were intercepted during the journey, or if they remained on land. The loss occurred in a wartime environment that prevented documenting the process, leaving without a trace one of the most important fossil sets discovered up to that moment. During the following decades, the search remained active without conclusive results. Both the government of the United States and that of China promoted initiatives to locate them, including rewards for verifiable information. None of these actions allowed the recovery of the remains, nor the determination of their location. Among the hypotheses proposed, some maintain that the fossils could have been captured by Japanese forces, while others point to their possible circulation in the illegal market. None has been confirmed through material evidence. In 1947, a new element emerged. Richard Bowen, a member of the United States Marine Corps stationed in Qinhuangdao during the Chinese Civil War, claimed to have found boxes with bones while excavating defensive positions. The find occurred during the night in an open trench in the vicinity of a military base. According to his account, after discovering the boxes, the soldiers covered the place again and abandoned the area. Shortly after, the unit was evacuated, and contact with that point was never resumed. Decades later, researchers used that testimony to identify the area where Bowen was stationed, today converted into an industrial zone. The analysis pointed to a specific spot, currently occupied by a parking lot, as the most probable location. No excavations have been performed at the site. Terrain conditions have prevented any direct intervention. The fate of the fossils disappeared in 1941 could never be determined. Yamashita's gold, the sealed deposits in caves of the Philippines. During the years of Japanese expansion in Southeast Asia, imperial forces gathered large quantities of goods originating from occupied territories. Precious metals, jewels, works of art, and historical objects were extracted from cities under military control and concentrated at different strategic points. A significant part of these resources was accumulated in Singapore, which functioned as a logistical center within the Japanese system in the region. As the course of the war began to become unfavorable, the Japanese command evaluated their transfer toward safe zones. However, toward 1943, Allied pressure had deteriorated maritime control, hindering any large-scale evacuation operation. In that context, it was decided to move part of the cargo toward the Philippines, where an organized military presence was still maintained. Under the command of General Tomoyuki Yamashita, operations in the Philippines coincided with the final phase of the conflict in the Pacific. The advance of United States forces, directed by Douglas MacArthur, progressively reduced Japanese control over the archipelago. With routes compromised and without the capacity for retreat, the priority ceased to be transport. It became concealment. At that moment, the materials were moved to caves, tunnels, and underground structures distributed in different regions, including mountainous areas and sectors near Manila. These spaces, natural or adapted, offered cover against bombings and allowed for restricted access. Information regarding their location was limited to a small number of people. The burial actions were executed in conditions of urgency, under constant pressure, and with limited resources. Japanese units found themselves surrounded with scarce operational margin. In that scenario, the storage points were sealed or abandoned without leaving systematic records. The military structure that had organized them collapsed before being able to document them. On September 3, 1945, Yamashita surrendered to United States forces. During subsequent interrogations, he was questioned about the whereabouts of these goods. He did not provide information regarding locations or procedures. On February 23, 1946, he was executed after being tried for war crimes. With his death, one of the few possible direct links to the location of these deposits disappeared. Many of those involved died during the war or were prosecuted, eliminating possible sources of information. In the following decades, accounts emerged about hidden deposits, and searches were carried out in different regions of the Philippines without verifiable results. In the decade of 1970, Rogelio Roxas claimed to have found a chamber with gold and valuable objects in the vicinity of Baguio. However, the find could not be confirmed independently nor replicated in subsequent explorations. Despite the use of modern technology, investigations have not identified structures that support the existence of large hidden reserves. The fate of the so-called Yamashita's treasure has never been confirmed. Blutfahne, the Nazi flag that vanished after the fall of the Reich. The Blutfahne, known as the Blood Flag, originated on November 9, 1923, during the failed coup d'etat in Munich. In the march toward the Feldherrenhalle, members of the party advanced in formation until the police opened fire. The flag-bearer, Heinrich Trambauer, was wounded and dropped the banner. At that moment, Andreas Bauriedl, mortally hit, fell onto the fabric, soaking it with his blood in the middle of the confrontation. After the collapse of the coup attempt, the flag disappeared temporarily in the middle of the confusion. Different versions exist about what happened. One maintains that Trambauer managed to remove it and hide it before handing it over to Karl Eggers. Another indicates that it was confiscated by the Munich authorities and returned later. In both cases, the object ended up under the custody of Eggers, who kept it until handing it over to Adolf Hitler after his release from Landsberg prison in December 1924. From that moment, the flag ceased to be a simple banner. In 1925, it was installed on a new mast, accompanied by a commemorative structure where the names of the 16 dead from the coup were inscribed. Since then, it came to occupy a central place in the party's ceremonies. During the following years, its presence became constant in official acts, especially at the Nuremberg Congresses. In these events, Hitler used the Blutfahne in a specific ceremony in which he touched other banners in an act called Fahnenweihe. That gesture was part of a ritual repeated at each annual meeting, in which new flags were presented and linked symbolically with the events of 1923. The use of the flag was not limited to these acts. It was also present in oaths of members of the SS and in ceremonies linked to key moments of the party. Its appearance marked specific events, and its handling remained restricted to established procedures within the organization. The custody was assigned permanently to a single responsible person. SS Sturmbannführer Jakob Grimminger was in charge of transporting it and exhibiting it in each public act. When it was not in use, the flag remained stored in party facilities in Munich under constant surveillance. With the development of the Second World War, the frequency of these ceremonies was reduced. As the German military situation deteriorated, the events in which the Blutfahne appeared became less common, although its value within the regime's system was not modified. The last time it was seen in public took place on October 18, 1944, during an incorporation ceremony of the Volkssturm. The act was directed by Heinrich Himmler and gathered several leaders of the regime. On that occasion, the flag was used according to the usual protocol, maintaining its function within the ceremony. After the ceremony of October 1944, the Blutfahne disappeared from the records. The bombings of January 1945 destroyed the Brown House in Munich, where party archives and objects were stored. It could have been destroyed at that moment or removed before the collapse of the regime, but none of these possibilities has been confirmed. Unlike other symbols of the Third Reich, its trail is cut off completely in the last months of the war. Anne Frank, the unknown about who revealed the hiding place. On August 4, 1944, in the building at Prinsengracht 263 in Amsterdam, several German agents entered the premises of a company linked to Otto Frank. It was not an immediate raid. For more than 2 hours, they went through the property, checking offices, warehouses, and work areas before heading toward a specific point of the building. Behind a movable bookcase, they found a hidden access. Upon opening it, they discovered a closed space where 8 people remained, who had lived there for more than 2 years without being detected. Among them was Anne Frank, along with her family and other occupants of the annex. The hiding place was not improvised. It was integrated within the structure of the building, and its access required knowing exactly where to look. From the outside, there were no visible signs that indicated its presence. Despite the constant activity in the place, the space had remained hidden for months under strict conditions of silence. The operation was directed by Karl Silberbauer, a member of the Sicherheitsdienst. The agents did not head directly to the annex upon entering the building. The time spent on the previous search indicates that the inspection did not begin with the precise localization of the hiding place. However, they ended up accessing exactly the point where it was located. After the discovery, the occupants were detained and taken from the place. They were interrogated and subsequently deported to different concentration camps. The procedure was recorded, but the origin of the information that led the agents to that space was not explained in any report. From that moment, the central doubt emerged. For years, it was maintained that an anonymous call had revealed the location of the annex. Under that version, someone with direct knowledge of the hiding place decided to communicate it to the authorities. Within that line, several names were pointed out. Willem van Maren, a warehouse employee, was considered suspicious due to his behavior within the building. Other people related to the work environment of Otto Frank were also mentioned. None of these accusations could be backed by conclusive evidence. Decades later, the analysis of police records proposed a different scenario. The agents who participated in the operation were not assigned exclusively to the search for hidden persons. Their presence in the building was linked to investigations into illegal activities, among them the use and distribution of rationing coupons. The property had already been identified for illegal activities, which made it a target for inspection. During the operation, the agents searched the building before finding the hidden access, which suggests that the discovery could have been accidental. Other investigations point to a possible betrayal, including the hypothesis that Arnold van den Berg gave information to the authorities. However, no conclusive evidence exists that confirms this version. It could never be established with certainty how the agents reached exactly the hidden annex. Rudolf Hess, the solo flight to negotiate an impossible peace. On May 10, 1941, in full development of the war in Europe, Rudolf Hess left his residence in Munich after communicating that he had to fulfill an official task. He wore a Luftwaffe uniform and assured that he would return that same night. He left no record of his destination in any register of the German High Command. Hours later, at the Augsburg airfield, he boarded a Messerschmitt Bf 110 modified with additional fuel tanks that extended its autonomy to about 2,500 kilometers. At 17:45, he took off alone. The aircraft headed northwest and left German airspace in the direction of the North Sea without escort or authorized plan. For weeks he had prepared that journey. He studied maps of Northern Europe, practiced long-range flights, and analyzed routes over open sea. The journey was not improvised. It responded to a specific objective set before takeoff. After several hours of flight, he crossed the British coast. At 22:08, radar stations detected the intrusion. Interception fighters were ordered to launch, but they failed to locate him. The Royal Observer Corps followed his trajectory as he advanced toward the interior of Scotland. The darkness made navigation difficult. Hess was looking for Dungavel House, residence of the Duke of Hamilton, situated south of Glasgow. He knew its location, but from the air he could not identify the exact point. The terrain remained invisible under the night. The fuel was running out. Without clear references, he climbed to about 1,800 meters, turned off the engines, and opened the cabin. The air pressure prevented him from leaving immediately. He inverted the plane in descent to free himself. After a brief blackout, he managed to throw himself into the void and deploy the parachute. The apparatus fell and exploded on the ground. Hess descended in a rural area about 20 kilometers from his destination. He was located by a farmer, David McLean, who had observed the impact. The pilot, wounded in one foot, presented himself with a false name, Captain Alfred Horn. He claimed to carry an urgent message addressed to the Duke of Hamilton. Minutes later, he was detained by local authorities. During the first interrogations, he revealed his identity and explained the reason for his trip. He had flown to Scotland to negotiate a peace agreement between Germany and the United Kingdom. He insisted that he must meet with the Duke, whom he considered a possible link. The next day, the Duke of Hamilton went to interview him. Hess set out his proposal, which contemplated the end of hostilities between both countries. The initiative did not coincide with the position of the British government, led by Winston Churchill, which rejected any negotiation under those terms. The reaction in Germany was immediate. After learning of his arrival in enemy territory, Hitler disavowed the mission and presented Hess as someone who acted on his own. The flight had no diplomatic backing, and its purpose never became clear. Hypotheses range from a personal initiative to an attempt at negotiation without authorization. The real origin of the mission that led Hess to Scotland in May 1941 could never be determined. Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo who got lost in Berlin. In April 1945, Berlin was an active front. Soviet forces advanced toward the political center of the Third Reich, while artillery hit the government zone continuously. In that scenario, Heinrich Müller remained within the Chancellery complex, integrated into the core where the last commanders of the regime were concentrated. From September 27, 1939, he directed the Gestapo, incorporated into the Reich Security Main Office after the reorganization of the police apparatus. His position placed him in the internal control structure of the state. In the final days, he continued active within the command perimeter, moving between offices while the system collapsed under constant bombings. During those days, he participated in interrogations and operational decisions. Among the documented episodes is his intervention in the case of Hermann Fegelein, an SS liaison officer accused of desertion. Despite the breakdown of communications and the loss of territorial control, he continued acting within an apparatus that still executed orders in fragmented conditions. On April 30, 1945, while Adolf Hitler committed suicide in the bunker, Müller continued in the complex. Witnesses confirmed his presence at that moment. On May 1, he was seen for the last time inside the Chancellery. According to subsequent statements, he claimed that he would not surrender to Soviet forces. After that day, his trail is lost. Soviet troops occupied the area in the following days. The immediate environment presented destroyed buildings, active fires, and unidentified bodies. In that scenario, his departure from the complex was not documented, nor was his capture among the prisoners. Subsequent investigations focused on his immediate circle. Linked addresses were inspected, documents were reviewed, and close contacts were interrogated, including Anna Schmid in 1947, without managing to establish his whereabouts. Among the testimonies that emerged after the fall of the city, one described the finding of an SS officer with Müller's documentation in the Chancellery Gardens. The body was said to have been buried along with thousands of victims in a mass grave in the old cemetery on Grosse Hamburger Straße. The area could not be examined at that moment. Years later, the historian Johannes Tuchel located records indicating that a body attributed to Müller was recovered in August 1945 and buried in a mass grave, along with another 3,000 corpses, although a forensic verification of this find has never been performed. Given the lack of physical evidence, reports emerged placing the head of the Gestapo under Soviet custody or moving toward Latin America, a hypothesis that led to the detention of a suspect in Panama in 1967, who turned out to be a false identity. Although the trail of the most wanted criminal of the Third Reich seems to cut off definitively in the besieged Berlin of 1945, the absence of a confirmed grave has kept the case open for decades before the eyes of intelligence agencies. Auschwitz, the hidden list of names without confirmed identity. In the subcamp of Monowitz, British prisoners of war were assigned to forced labor at the IG Farben synthetic rubber plant, integrated into the Auschwitz complex. In that environment, they shared extreme conditions with other inmates and remained exposed to the constant bombings against the industrial facilities. On August 20, 1944, an Allied attack hit the shelter of 38 British prisoners, causing their immediate death. Their bodies were buried in the Oświęcim cemetery, but a second bombing destroyed the place weeks later. It was not until 2004 that a commemorative plaque was installed to honor their memory in the presence of international authorities. In May 2009, the historian Dominik Sinowicz located a fragment of white celluloid hidden deliberately under the rubble of an old bunker. The document contained 17 surnames written in pencil, among them Osborne and Gardner, 8 of which presented a check mark, in addition to German terms translated into English, and a numerical sequence without apparent context. The authorities of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum initiated arrangements with British archives to identify the individuals, considering hypotheses ranging from Jewish prisoners to SS collaborators. The find of the surname Gardiner, matching a royal gunner buried in Krakow, has not managed to establish a link with the rest of the names, nor clarify the reason for the list. Without official records to support it, this fragment remains as an isolated human trace, a secret list that the rubble of Monowitz kept for decades. Pearl Harbor, the intercepted message that could have anticipated the attack. In November 1941, while relations between Japan and the United States deteriorated, Tokyo sent instructions to its embassies to activate a covert communication system in case of diplomatic rupture. The mechanism consisted of inserting coded phrases into shortwave meteorological transmissions. For the scenario of conflict with the United States, the defined signal was Higashi no Kaze Am, translated as East Wind Rain. The phrase was to be repeated in regular broadcasts to be detected by listening stations. On December 4, United States operators intercepted communications related to these instructions. Ralph Briggs, from Station M in Cheltenham, Maryland, reported having captured a transmission that included the phrase associated with that code. The information was distributed among intelligence agencies, including the Navy, the Army, and the White House. That same day, Lieutenant Commander Alvin Kramer, in charge of translations in the Navy, received the content and interpreted it as a possible execution signal. The message was shared with different levels of command. Some subsequent testimonies indicated that its meaning pointed to an imminent entry into war. Despite this, a direct alert was not issued to the forces deployed in Pearl Harbor. In parallel, other interceptions reinforced the deterioration of the situation. Japan had set deadlines for the end of negotiations and ordered the destruction of encryption equipment in its embassies. These elements indicated an imminent rupture, but within United States intelligence there were disagreements about the operational interpretation of that information. After the attack of December 7, official investigations began to reconstruct the events. In that context, Captain Lawrence Safford maintained that the winds message had been an authentic signal that anticipated the start of the war. According to his version, the warning had been received days before the attack. The versions did not coincide. Some officers claimed that the signal was never received or did not contain specific information, while others interpreted it as a possible warning. During the investigations, a key element emerged. The original document associated with that signal disappeared from the Navy archives. All records were complete, except for one, identified as File 7001. Years later, the analysis of declassified documents suggested that the coded phrases could have been transmitted after the start of the attack, questioning its value as a prior warning. Subhas Chandra Bose, the death in Taiwan that still generates doubts. In April 1945, Subhas Chandra Bose abandoned Rangoon along with members of the Indian National Army and advanced toward Moulmein under constant pressure from British and United States forces. Completing the final journey on foot after the crossing of the Sitang River became isolated. At the beginning of May, he reached the area along with reduced forces after the campaigns in Burma. During the following weeks, he moved toward Bangkok and Singapore, while the Japanese military situation deteriorated and the positions in Southeast Asia remained exposed to Allied offensives. At the beginning of August, faced with the British advance and continuous bombings, his evacuation was considered. On August 3, 1945, he received instructions from Lieutenant General Saburo Isoda to move toward Saigon. Days later, after the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he abandoned Singapore on August 16th. From that moment, contradictory versions began to emerge about his destination, including the possibility of heading toward territory under Soviet control. On August 17, at the Saigon airfield, his departure was organized in a Mitsubishi Ki-21 bomber. Only 2 places were authorized for his group. Bose traveled along with his secretary, Colonel Habib-ur-Rahman. The aircraft took off with an overload, also transporting Japanese officers, among them Lieutenant General Tsunemasa Shide. After a stopover in Da Nang, the flight continued toward Taiwan. On August 18th, during takeoff in Taipei, one of the engines detached. The plane lost control, impacted against the ground, and was enveloped in flames. Part of the crew died instantly. Bose and Rahman managed to get out of the burning fuselage. Witnesses saw him enveloped in fire with severe burns on his head and body. He was transferred to the Nanmon Military Hospital, where Dr. Taneyoshi Yoshimi tried to stabilize him through transfusions and intensive treatment. His condition deteriorated rapidly until he entered a coma and passed away between 2100 and 2200. The body was cremated in Taipei, and his death was officially announced days later. However, the lack of direct evidence, such as photographs or a verifiable certificate, generated doubts from the start. Some maintained that he had died from the injuries of the accident. Others claimed that he managed to escape. Subsequent investigations offered contradictory conclusions. Even decades later, it was questioned that the ashes preserved in Tokyo really corresponded to Bose. Submarine U-869, the shipwreck found where no one was looking for it. In December 1944, the German submarine U-869 received the order to cross the Atlantic and operate off the coast of the United States. Its commander, Helmuth Neuerberg, was to approach New York and attack naval targets in a phase of the war in which Germany was already operating under increasingly limited conditions. During the crossing, communications with the High Command were affected. In that context, an instruction was issued that modified the mission. The submarine was to abandon its course and head toward Gibraltar to patrol the African coast. That message was never received. Without confirmation of new orders, the U-869 continued advancing toward the west. At the beginning of February 1945, the vessel was in the western Atlantic. Allied forces controlled the flow of information and monitored the presence of submarines in the area. Alerts were activated to intercept possible threats, but no direct contact was recorded. 56 crew members disappeared along with the vessel. Only one of the men assigned, the radio operator Herbert Gushevsky, did not embark due to an illness and remained on land. After the war, records placed the sinking of the submarine in the vicinity of Gibraltar. That localization was maintained for decades without direct verification. The fate of the U-869 remained associated with an area that was never confirmed through physical evidence. In 1991, information transmitted among fishermen pointed to a spot about 96 kilometers off the coast of New Jersey. The concentration of fish suggested the presence of a submerged structure. Diver Bill Nagel organized an expedition along with John Chatterton and other explorers to descend to the site. At about 70 meters deep, in conditions of low visibility and intense currents, the hull of a submarine appeared. The structure was preserved, but presented no visible identification. At that moment, its origin could not be determined. The dives continued in the following years. The team recovered objects from the interior and examined different compartments. Among the finds were tableware with German symbols and human remains corresponding to the crew. Those elements confirmed that it was a German vessel, although its identity remained unestablished. In 1997, new explorations allowed the identification of the submarine as the U-869. That result contradicted the version accepted for half a century. The vessel had not sunk in Gibraltar. It had reached the United States coast and remained at the bottom of the Atlantic off New Jersey. The find resolved its location, but opened a different question. What caused its destruction? The hull presented significant damage in the area of the conning tower. The main hypothesis indicates that the submarine could have been hit by one of its own acoustic torpedoes, designed to follow the sound of engines, with the risk of altering its trajectory. No records of firing exist, nor operational information that allows for the reconstruction of the final sequence. Jean Moulin, the clandestine meeting that ended in betrayal. In June 1943, in occupied France, the resistance was going through a critical phase. Various clandestine groups operated in a fragmented way while trying to coordinate their structures under a common direction. In that context, a meeting was organized in the town of Caluire, on the outskirts of Lyon, with the objective of unifying strategic decisions at a time of constant pressure from the German occupation. The encounter took place on June 21 at the home of a doctor, a point selected for its discretion within an area where clandestine activity was frequent. The meeting was attended by leaders of several resistance movements, among them Jean Moulin, direct representative of Charles de Gaulle in occupied territory. His presence made the encounter a key concentration for the reorganization of the French clandestine structure. During the course of the meeting, the Gestapo raided the place. The intervention was immediate and precise. The attendees were detained on the spot. Jean Moulin was captured at that moment, along with other high-level members of the resistance. The operation left no margin for reaction or escape for the majority of those present. After his detention, Moulin was moved to German custody, where he was subjected to interrogations under severe conditions. His physical state deteriorated rapidly. He was seen for the last time in critical condition and died weeks later without having been released. His capture represented a direct blow to the coordination efforts of the resistance at a decisive point of the conflict. The central element of the episode is not only the detention, but the way in which it occurred. The meeting had been organized under strict measures of clandestinity. The location was not public, the participants were selected, and the risk of exposure was considered in each phase of the planning. Despite this, the German authorities arrived with exactness at the place and at the precise moment in which the meeting was taking place. That precision introduced a doubt that has not been resolved. The possibility that the information had been leaked from inside the resistance's own circle began to be considered immediately after the events. Among the attendees was René Hardy, a member of clandestine railway networks, whose situation generated suspicions from the start. Hardy had been detained by the Gestapo on June 7, 1943, 2 weeks before the meeting. During that period, he was interrogated and subsequently released. On the day of the raid in Caluire, he did not remain under custody like the rest of the detainees. He managed to leave the place and escape in circumstances that could not be conclusively clarified. This fact placed him at the center of the suspicions. After the war, René Hardy was tried on 2 occasions and acquitted for lack of evidence. However, the doubts about his possible involvement never disappeared. Some records indicate that the Gestapo received information from the resistance environment, although no conclusive evidence exists that confirms it. What is clear is that the meeting was located with precision and Jean Moulin was captured. It could never be established how that information was obtained. As in other episodes of this war, the facts were recorded, but the origin of what happened remained hidden, leaving open questions that not even subsequent investigations managed to resolve.